Welcome to Civil Discourse. I'm Jayme Wojciechowski here with Marilyn Brown. And today I would actually like to discuss violent protests and rioting. Specifically, we're hearing a lot of that narrative in relationship to the Black Lives Matter movement. We've also heard a little bit with the Dakota Access Pipeline, there being no actual violence as part of that those protests, but discussion about if the protests would be more effective if there was violence and getting media coverage and various things. On the first topic, I'm interested in what you think. Why do you think protests become violent?
hmm I think I think protests become violent out of a lack of acknowledgement. I think that protests, if you ignore something for long enough and kind of try to either spin the narrative to something else or just ignore it, sweep it under the rug, things tend to build and get more as more incidents happen, as more acts of violence against the community happens, people get more and more frustrated. And so I think that what happens is there is a building, and that can create a violent outcome. And I also think that that's not always the case. I think that Black Lives Matter movement specifically has been very aware of the narrative that it could turn violent at any moment. And, I think that they've done a really, really mindful job of really working on peacefully protesting and making that the goal. And I think that also what happens is that people can manipulate the narrative by seeing a peaceful movement, by seeing a peaceful protest going on and continuing to be ignored, and then coming in with a different agenda that has nothing to do with that movement and using that to act out violently, to create more fear. So I think that it can be a combination of different things that can lead to a peaceful, nonviolent protest moving towards more violent rioting type action or property damage, things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was actually hesitant to make this a discussion, mostly because I feel primarily right now in relationship to the Black Lives Matter movement, the vast majority of it is peaceful. And I think the media does a large disservice in really only reporting things when they're violent and making things seem a lot more violent than they are. I mean, the only coverage um, the mainstream media has really done of the Dakota Access Pipeline has been when there was perceived violence that actually didn't happen, or the footage of the private security with their attack dogs attacking protesters. So the only time it's been in the mainstream media has been when it's violent. And I think this does two things. I think it distracts people. Going back to the Black Lives Matter movement, I had this conversation with a lot of people in my family who, whenever I talk about the movement, the first thing they bring up is, well, people can't be violent. They can't be violent. And I try to explain, well, you're focusing on 0.5%, maybe that much, of people who are acting out violently. And I also think in that context, I think it's kind of a subconscious defense mechanism, because I sometimes get a little unmindful in the way I respond to that, just because I know it's distracting from what's actually going on, and I almost feel that specific debate is a useless debate. Whether the violence happened. So if you actually if you think that there shouldn't be violence, we should be looking at why that violence occurred and then how to correct it. Yeah, and I think the media also in reporting the way it does, with the violence does occur, I think it very much encourages the violence. Because if the media is saying, well, we're only going to cover you, we're only going to listen to you when there's violence, there's actually an incentive within the protests to be violent so that there is the coverage and what you're concerned about, what you're trying to get across is heard. As opposed to if the media was covering the 99% that are peaceful, everyone would be peaceful because those are the people who are being covered.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think, to add to that, you look at what happened in Ferguson in, I think this was 2014. There was really very little coverage, but as soon as property damage happened, and I think it was a Rite Aid or something like that got burned down, some kind of convenience store, that was the main point of conversation on any kind of mainstream media coverage about it. And it was, well, these protesters don't need to be violent and this is wrong and they're burning down their communities, and nobody is justifying property damage. Nobody is justifying burning down anything. That's clearly not the best way to make change and to help the community. But at the same time, a lot of times this idea that like things are so much more sacred than people concerns me, and I think that the media, I think that there's a lot of just interest in blood and guts, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And just in their, that kind of that the entertainment factor of it, unfortunately, plays a huge piece. And so I think people find, things that look violent, fires and things like that, much more interesting or entertaining than, peaceful action for days on end.
Mm-hmm.
Look at like what happened, Democracy Spring in DC. That was such a peaceful action, and there were arrests and it was very peaceful, but there was very, very, very little coverage. And this was at the Capitol. I think they maybe covered it when Rosario Dawson was involved, which is great, which I think is really important that, celebrities and people with a bigger voice do get involved with a bigger platform, because that went on for days, and there was very, very little coverage about it. And it's frustrating. And I think activists and the people fighting get very, very frustrated with the lack of a voice, of that platform being heard.
Yeah, I think it has to do partially, and a big part of it with what you're saying is ratings, and that if something is violent, it's going to keep people's attention longer and they're more apt to watch it, as opposed to the peaceful protests. You're just not going to get the same ratings. But I think there's also a part of it that, from looking at all the media outlets, a part of it that has to do with not wanting to actually have the conversation about what's at the core of what's going on. And I don't know if that comes from them thinking that conversation is going to hurt ratings, or if it comes from their investors and the advertisers not wanting that to happen. Because you look at Democracy Now! Or a bunch of the news outlets that are online that are that have no advertising and are all from viewership, and they a lot of times do cover it. They're the ones covering these things no one else is covering. So there is some demand for it, and in a way, journalists can do it if they want to. It interests me on if it's just for ratings, or if there's something deeper with not wanting to have the conversation. Because it's just, to me, I see it and it's just so clearly a distraction. It's easier to say, oh, well, these people shouldn't be violent, they shouldn't be destructive, and they're ruining property, and who's going to pay for the property, and why isn't the Black Lives Matter coming out and condoning this loudly, and all these things, instead of talking about, one, why those people are being violent, noting that the vast majority of people are not violent, and actually talking about what is going on
The
on a deeper
problem,
level.
yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely agree that there's a deeper issue, at play. That there's a lack of. I think there's an investment in continuing with the narrative that's already been given and that's already been shown, and so there's little incentive to do it a different way. And, I think that there are journalists who do a great job of really honestly covering what's going on. But in the kind of the global scale, there isn't a lot of incentive for that. And I also think, it's very similar to what we talked about on Civil Discourse previously about Colin Kaepernick, and how nobody wanted to talk about why he's been kneeling. No one wanted to talk about the issue. They just want to condemn him for disrespecting the flag. How is that a bigger problem than the problem that he's addressing? But you saw them spend hours and hours, pundits spending hours talking about bringing in veterans and people from all different sides just to talk about whether it's okay to protest the flag or not, completely refusing to talk about what he's actually protesting. And he does a great job of, when they ask him about it and bring up things like his, pig socks and things like that, he does a great job of being like, this is the problem. Unarmed Black and brown people are continuing to be, killed with no justice. This is the problem. This is why I'm doing it. And pointing out that all of these other things are a distraction.
Yeah, and there seems to be, to me, a little hypocrisy there with the narrative from the same people being, well, activists should be peaceful and not be violent. And then those same people who are saying that are then condemning people who are kneeling peacefully. So it's like, well, what you're really saying, we want you to be silent. You're not saying we want you to, this is the right way to protest and this is the wrong way. You're just saying we don't want to talk about it, is what I get from it.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think that, beyond that, there is a bigger incentive at play to continue to criminalize certain communities. And I think that's really what drives a lot of the media circus, because the prison industry there's so much money in the for-profit prison industry. And so when there's that much money in an industry, there's going to be a lot of work to keep that system going and keep that system afloat. And so I think that our corporate media has, and I don't think there's an awareness on every single level. Like, I don't think that everybody intentionally realizes being fed certain narratives to pay attention to. And you even see people who leave, like MSNBC, when Melissa Harris Perry left, for example, you see people when they leave these kind of big media corporations and talking about, I had no idea that this was kind of what was really at play, and I worked there, and so I think that unfortunately there's still a small percentage of interest or people who control a lot of what we see, and so we have to really work hard to get a different story.
Yeah,
I kind of digress from the violent part, but I think that it all kind of is underneath that.
So, I guess as a mindfulness practitioner, is violence ever justifiable?
I think as a mindfulness practitioner, I would say justifiable is a judgment that I don't know if it's necessary to make. I think it's more effective to, because I can see where violence comes from and I can see how things get to that point. I think that, we can use the golden rule and say that hurting another person is not right, hurting someone else, doing, unto someone that you wouldn't want done to you. But at the same time, I think that to say to just condemn violent action as wrong misses, or as unjustified misses the point of what's under that action, and will end up leading to more violent action.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think it's interesting. One of the biggest misconceptions with mindfulness that I often encounter is when I use the word compassion. And there's this idea that having compassion for something means that you agree with it, or that you're approving of what you're showing compassion. And for me, compassion is more about um, searching for understanding, which is to me what mindfulness really is. And I think I'm 100% agree with you and everything you're saying, in that um, it's a distraction to talk about if it's justifiable, as opposed to saying, well, if it happens, let's figure out why it happened so we can create conditions so that it doesn't happen in the future, which I think is the part of the conversation that's most missing in every aspect of our culture and our society, especially in politics. We so much get on, well, is this right? Is this wrong? And we want to go to sides. We want to make these concrete
Neat little boxes
categories.
to put
Yeah,
everything.
yeah. Instead of just saying, well, this is what it is. Let's talk about why it's like that and look at the many different ways we can address it and which one of those ways is most mindful.
Exactly. Yeah. And everything in the world is so much more nuanced. So everything doesn't fit into these nice little boxes. We want to judge things and say that's right and that's wrong, and the world doesn't work that way. And so I think if you look at the idea of violence, if people continue to protest unheard, things continue to build. And that's like science. Things will continue to boil over. If there's more incidents, things will continue to build. And so rather than looking at the maybe outlier incidents, because oftentimes the acts of violence are outlier incidents if you look at the whole. If we just focus on those outlier incidents, okay, well, people got pushed to a boiling point over here, and so it spilled over, and now let's focus on that piece and forget the whole, then we're going to continue to have more of that. Yeah. We're going to continue to have more of that spillover until change happens. And so I think that that's an awareness, and that's a mindfulness that we kind of all have to have, that we can't continue to ignore problems. They don't go away. They continue to build and get bigger and bigger.
And I think the labeling of right and wrong and the leading with the judgment most often, because that's an act of ego in doing that often leads to more of what you're judging. So if you're, I was just telling a family member this, I was saying, well, if you're actually upset about the violence and don't think that violence should exist, you should show up to the peaceful protest and do those things, because you just being upset and judging that and staying out of it, just saying that's wrong, is just going to continue the conditions that helped create that violence. So yeah, I think just being mindful and leading with trying to understand why things are happening, as opposed to feeling, and it's hard because it's a defense mechanism. It's easy. It's much easier to say this is bad and I'm separate from that bad thing, and that's something that's over here that's wrong, and I'm not connected to it, as opposed to actually take the time and try to understand and put yourself in that person's shoes and do those things. That's hard to do, is to find that common ground, especially when, I try to be as mindful as possible, but I'm mostly a pacifist and I'm not for the violence. No matter what I do, there's a judgment on top of it. So I have to
Mhm.
fight that judgment with the understanding. It's not like I can lead with just understanding and there's no judgment there. That's an unrealistic human thing. We judge, but
We judge. Yeah.
it's being mindful and checking the judgment. It's like checking your privilege. It's like any of those things. It's not trying to push it away. It's just accepting that it's there. And once you're aware of it, you can actually be conscious of how you're using it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And with that awareness, with that mindful awareness, not allowing it to create walls around you and other people, because I think that's where we lose our ability to connect and to hear each other, is that we feel these judgments, and rather than having that mindful awareness of it, we react viscerally to it and create space between us and the other person. And so I think that that's where we kind of lose it. And so really it all kind of goes back down to personally being mindful, working on your own personal mindfulness practice, to be aware of your own judgments and your own privilege and just your own narrative that you have in your own head about these things and about people and experiences. And that's challenging. And I think that in and of itself is hard work to do. There's a lot that comes out when you start like turning the mirror on yourself and trying to figure out, what are my beliefs? What are the things that have caused me to judge other people and act in ways that I don't, that don't fit with my own values. And I think also there's a vulnerability to that's difficult. It's difficult to be vulnerable and rather than judge, look for a connection. Connecting is a vulnerable thing. And oftentimes, we're armored up when we go out in the world. And so it's hard to get through that and to allow each other to connect, especially right now in this lovely political climate that we're in. Everybody I feel like is very armored up, and we're all very defensive about our beliefs and our views on things. And so it's tough.
Yeah, and it's an endless process when you're doing that too. A friend of mine posted on Facebook an article, and it was basically about how mindfulness and activism can't go together, and it was riddled with a lot of the kind of Western mindfulness stereotypes. A lot of what it talked about
Mm-hmm.
was, well, the issue is we don't think enough, not thinking, and that's a huge. It's just a huge, I think. Um, I don't know. I don't know any mindfulness practitioner of any kind that would say that mindfulness or meditation is about not thinking. Um, it's the exact
Yeah.
opposite. And I think a lot of it is about checking yourself with your thoughts. So it's actually thinking more, but instead of letting what we call the monkey mind, where you're just all over the place, it's actually being aware of what you're thinking, and
Mm-hmm.
it actually making it conscious as opposed to subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's, oh, I have this judgment, and now I'm aware of it. So now I can ask myself, why did I have this judgment? And
Mm-hmm.
if I separate myself from this judgment, how can I understand the thing I'm judging so that I don't
Right.
have the reaction I just had? So it's
Mm-hmm.
all this. That's a lot of thinking that
Mm-hmm.
goes
Mm-hmm.
into
Yes,
being
it's thinking
mindful.
about your thinking. So it's like meta thinking. It's
Mhm.
yeah, it's a lot of thinking, and I think that is a misconception that you just try to turn everything off, but it's really just about being aware, being fully
Mhm.
aware, and we're so often on autopilot. We're so often not aware of the chatter that goes on in our mind throughout the day. When I first start working with people and just kind of check in on their thoughts, we have a constant running tape that's spewing out things all day long, and just to be mindful of what that's about and where that's coming from, and without judgment, without allowing yourself to even attach to those thoughts or give much meaning, but just to look at them and step back and observe what's going on in your own mind, is that's kind of where the work happens with mindfulness. But yeah, there is definitely a huge misconception that you just kind of turn it all off, and you know that might be nice. It might be nice to be able to just turn it
I
all
know, wouldn't
off,
it be
but I haven't
nice?
had that
I
experience.
think I think a lot of that's sleeping, even though you think you just don't remember it. But
Right.
Well, thank you very much. This was great. I'm glad we had the conversation.
Yeah, this
Now
is
that I
awesome.
was originally hesitant, but I think it was good, and I would encourage anyone who's watching to continue the conversation. You can tweet us individually, or you can tweet Civil D TV, Facebook at Civil D TV, and just keep the conversation going because I think it's important. A lot of it is the way we see things and our opinions. And it's always nice to see people who have different life experiences, what they go through. That's what being mindful is about. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Awesome. Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful night. Thank you.